Okay, so this is our last of the three videos on what I'm calling our pre 1450 context. And we'll call this part three. And we'll call this the Crises in the 14th century. So the 14th century was a pretty dire time in Europe, and we'll get to those three crises here in a second. But to kind of set the stage for where we're going, let's talk about the century just prior to this. So the 13th century, the 1200s. So by about 1200, we start to see rich people, which were kind of a rarity in Western Europe. Rich people begin the process of slowly, and I mean really slowly, pulling the church out of, I guess we'll say, secular affairs. But primarily what we're talking about here is education. So we're kind of starting the process of creating secular education. Education that is not necessarily tied to the church. You're still going to learn a lot about religion, but it's not necessarily going to be taught to you by the church. So we're going to start to see this slow extrication of government and education and the economy from the church by rich people. Rich non-church people. So these are people like merchants who have money but aren't necessarily tied to the church. And a really good example of this is a guy named Thomas Aquinas. Who was a Catholic priest who tried to kind of combine Christian thought with Greek and Roman thought. So this wouldn't have been able to happen without the Crusades, because the Crusades kind of repopularized Greek and Roman thought in Western Europe. This process of trying to combine Christianity with Greek and Roman thought was called scholasticism. And since this is an educational thing, it's where we get the word scholastic from. Thomas Aquinas would then later on become Saint Thomas Aquinas, and he is the patron saint of scholars and students. So if you're Catholic and you want a patron saint, this is a guy to consider. But this kind of marks the end of a stable period in Europe. So kind of between we'll say like 1000 and 1300, Europe was pretty stable. Remember, the Crusades are happening outside of Europe. But Europe itself is pretty stable. It had gotten over the collapse of the Roman Empire. That was long, long ago. Feudalism was kind of working, and Europe was kind of stable. It was actually kind of getting better. Like, it was becoming a little bit more rich. It was becoming a little bit more connected to the rest of the world. And that's when we get these three giant crises of the 14th century. And they happen pretty much right at the start of the 1300s. So we're going to quickly go through these three things, because in the aftermath of these three crises, that's where the Renaissance comes from. So let's go over these three crises real quick. And then once we're done with that, we can start thinking about how Europe rebuilds itself in the Renaissance. So the first of these crises that come along was what was called the Great Famine. So starting in the 1300s, Europe is, we'll use fancy words, beset with three horrible crises. Okay, so the first one of these, the Great Famine, which lasts from 1315 to 1317. It was caused by a variety of factors. Famines usually are. There was some bad harvests. There was some bad weather. Some climatologists, people who study the climate, think that this might be the beginning of what's called the Little Ice Age, which was a global drop in temperature that lasted for about 500 years, or at least the end of what's called the medieval warm period. So, however you want to think about it, there wasn't enough food to eat. Whether it was because the people were bad at farming, the weather was bad, or something that was completely out of everybody's control, the climate, whatever you want to believe, what ended up happening was that there wasn't enough food. So the population of Europe was maybe too high before this. And what the Great Famine did was correct the overpopulation. You know, pretty much like Thanos style. Like, there's too many people, we've got to get rid of some of them. And the Great Famine was nature's way of doing that. Millions starved to death. Millions starved and died of related illnesses. And one of the worst things about starvation is that you know it's happening when it's happening to you. So not only did millions starve, but we also get a big increase in crime because starving people become desperate and they're willing to commit violence to get food or money. There are even cases of cannibalism. Not many, but there were a few documented cases of cannibalism during this period. We also see, and this will be important for understanding what's going on in the Renaissance, a decrease in faith in the church. Like, why would I believe in a God that's just going to make me starve to death? I get nothing out of this if I'm going to starve. So there's a decrease in faith in the church and an increase in crime. But the thing about famines is that they typically end pretty quickly, because by 1317 the population had dropped to a point where the new levels of food could match the new lower populations in Europe. So the famine ends all by itself. The next one was not nearly as misunderstood. Like, we know what happened with this next one, and it's a war. The 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War, which actually goes on for a lot longer than 100 years. So it goes on from 1317 all the way to 1453. So it's actually 116 years. So this is a war between England and France. And without going too deep into the causes of this war, the kings of both countries believed they were next in line to be king of the other country. That's what the 100 Years' War was about. The King of England thinks that he's also the King of France, and the King of France also thinks he's the King of England. This was mostly fought in France. And wars, just like today, it just completely destroyed the countryside. It destroyed the country. Millions of people died just because of being caught in the violence, lack of food, disease, associated violence, like not even in the war, but soldiers were not usually the best people, and they would just, pretty much do whatever they wanted to the people that they encountered. So this pretty much destroyed France. But it did have some other effects. It began the process of centralizing the governments of England and France. And when I say centralizing, what we're really talking about is streamlining the collection of taxes. As I've mentioned a few times, wars are expensive. And so having a streamlined collection of taxes is necessary if you're going to fight a war for 100 years. So centralizing the government means streamlining the collection of taxes, which means kind of moving away from a feudal system into something else. But we'll talk about that more in depth as we move through the course. It's also famous for introducing the longbow. Now, that doesn't sound all that impressive, but what the longbow could do was shoot an arrow that penetrates suits of armor. And so right there, that kind of ends the whole like romanticized idea of the Middle Ages. There are no more knights in armor because a guy who's trained how to shoot a longbow can kill that guy from like 500 yards away. Suits of armor are made irrelevant by a longbow. Longbows are cheap. You can have hundreds of longbows for what it takes to arm one guy in a suit of armor. And it takes like a day's worth of training to be able to fire a longbow. You don't even have to aim, you just all fire at once. The other thing that the 100 Years' War is known for is Joan of Arc. So we don't often get a lot of opportunities to talk about famous women in this course, especially at this time in the course. So whenever we get a chance to, I always like to bring them up. So Joan of Arc was a French peasant girl who heard the voice of God. And the voice of God told her to run the French army. And by the time when Joan heard this, the French were kind of losing the war. And there were enough French leaders who were desperate, and they thought, what have we got to lose? Let's give her a shot. And this 17-year-old peasant girl turned out to be an amazing general. And so she won several battles. The problem is, French peasant girls aren't supposed to get visions from God. And so she ends up being kidnapped by some of her own soldiers. She was kidnapped by the French, she was kidnapped by the French, and she was burned at the stake for her crime of being a good general and hearing the voice of God. She's been sainted. She's a saint now, and she's one of the patron saints of France, but, that's the fate of peasant girls in the 14th century. Know your place, I guess. The last one of these is probably the biggest one of these, and that's the Black Death. So this was an epidemic of bubonic plague. It originated in China around the year 1331. It spread across Eurasian trade routes until it got to Italy in 1348. All told, about 50 to 60% of Europe's population died, which comes out to be roughly 25 to 30 million people. Similar numbers died in China. And especially hard hit were the Italian city-states. The Italian city-states were the hardest hit. They had higher population densities, so the disease spread faster. And they had more contact with merchants. So in some cases, the Italian city-states, they had death rates of like 80 to 90%. And the same kinds of effects happened with the Great Famine as they did here. So we also see an increase in crime and a decrease in faith. And so the point of all of these crises, so the famine, the war, and the epidemic, all put together, and it gives us enough of a slate wiping. We're wiping the slate clean now, and we're going to kind of start over. So all three of these crises, the three crises create a clean slate for Europe to start over and try some new ideas. Now, a lot of these new ideas that Europe is going to try are kind of rediscovered Greek and Roman ideas. So, brought from the Crusades. So what we're going to do when we start the next set of videos is look at how this clean slate from these crises gave us an opportunity to start something new, and we're going to see what that new thing is called the Renaissance. So the next set of videos will be about the Renaissance. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.